Hey everyone, welcome to this second video of this module and actually the last video of this module. In this one, I'm going to go over some animal taxonomy vocabulary that's going to set you up for success next week when we really dive into animal taxonomy, so looking at the animal kingdom. But you're going to need to know some certain vocab words in order to be successful with that. So first, I just want to remind you about the difference between a kingdom and a phylum. You might remember that in our taxonomy, we have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, and they get more specific as you go. So a kingdom is a large taxonomic or taxonomy group, and it includes a lot of closely related phyla, but for our purposes for this video, know that the kingdom we're talking about for this whole video is Animalia or animal kingdom. But within the animal kingdom, there are many different phyla or groups of closely related classes. So you can notice we go kingdom, phylum, class. So phyla has a bunch of classes that are similar. Classes have a bunch of orders that are similar. Orders have a bunch of families that are similar. Families have a bunch of genuses that are similar, and genuses have a bunch of species that are similar. But the kingdom is a larger taxonomy group that's closely related phyla, and phylum is a group of closely related classes. And we're going to break the animal kingdom down into different phyla and actually into some different classes during the next week's module. So I want you to understand some vocabulary that we use to assign animals to different groups of classes or phyla, and that way you're going to be able to be prepared for next week. So here's the vocabulary that you'll need to know. First, you're going to have to think about an organism's body symmetry when you put it from just knowing that it's in the kingdom Animalia to being able to put it into a different phyla. You're going to have to know how its symmetry is. So asymmetrical means there is no symmetry at all. And a good example species of that is sponge. And you can see that here. You can't divide this in any way and find symmetry. Another type of symmetry is radial symmetry, and that's a body plan where the symmetry repeats around the center. So you can see this anemone has radial symmetry. And then bilateral symmetry is where you could cut something evenly into two equal halves. So insects, for example, have bilateral symmetry. Next thing to think about is cephalization. Cephalization, and I know that's kind of a funky word to spell, but cephalization means that an organism has a bunch of nerve cells at the front of its body. In humans, that means we have a brain. That's a bunch of nerve cells at the top and front of our body. But there are other organisms that are cephalized or have cephalization. And this flatworm is an example of an organism that's cephalized. Even though it doesn't have a complex brain, it does have nerve cells that actually make up its eye spots right at the front of its body, and so we consider it cephalized. Does that mean it's complex and has a brain like a human? No. But does it mean it has a bundle of nerve cells like an eye spot at the front? Yes. Another thing we think about is getting energy, and you should be familiar with these words at this point. If an organism is an autotroph, it can produce its own food. It's also known as a producer. So plants are autotrophs. They can produce their own food. Certain different types of protists that we'll talk about are autotrophs. They produce their own food. But in the animal world, most organisms are going to be heterotroph, and they obtain their energy from eating something else. It's also called a consumer. But we're going to break that down. You want to make sure that you remember that herbivores only eat plants, omnivores eat both plants and animals, and carnivores eat only other animals. And there are some example species that you can see in the picture. Also, there are a couple of other ways to get energy, which we haven't talked about as much. One way is called detritivore, and this earthworm is a detritivore because it only feeds on plants and animals that are dead. It only feeds on dead matter. And that's a little bit different from decomposer. When I think of decomposer, I think of a fungus that actually puts digestive juices out and soaks up nutrients. But detritivores have mouths in many instances. Like a worm actually has a mouth and it can eat, but it only eats dead things. So an earthworm could be considered a detritivore. A vulture could be considered a detritivore. Another word that you might not have known about is filter feeder. Filter feeders get their nutrients that are suspended in the water. So in the water, there are little tiny nutrients and they go through this sponge. A sponge is a really great example of a filter feeder. They just have water pass through them and they get their nutrients straight out of the water. So anything that just lets water pass through and they get their nutrients from the water is a filter feeder. And lastly, we talked about this way back in the fall, but you might remember that a parasite lives in or on another organism, which is the host, and it harms it. So this is a fish with a tongue-eating isopod parasite. That parasite right there lives in the fish's mouth and takes some of its food, which harms it. All right, another thing having to do with digestive system or digestion is called a coelom. So coelom is actually spelled Coelom, but you pronounce it coelom. So kind of like Salem, but coelom. But it's spelled really weird. So Coelom means coelom. And what it is a fluid-filled body cavity that's lined in our bodies by an inner layer and an outer layer. So this fluid-filled body cavity is where a lot of different things are within the body. Like in humans, we would say that we're coelomates. We have a coelom. And within our coelom is our lungs, our muscles, our kidneys, our reproductive system. Basically, on the inside layer of the coelom, you have your digestive system, your intestines and stuff like that. On the very outside of the coelom, you have the body covering, which is usually thought of as the skin. But all that stuff that is between your intestines and your skin, like your muscles and your bones, those are all considered part of your coelom. So coelom is just a fluid-filled area of your body that is between your digestive system and your skin. And many different organisms have that. In fact, animals a lot of times have that, but there are animals, like for example, sponges, that don't have a coelom at all. So we'll get to looking at that next week, but whether or not an organism has a coelom can indicate which phylum it goes into within the animal kingdom. All right, next up, let's talk about circulatory system. So circulatory system is how we get blood to move through our bodies to bring oxygen to our muscles, to take carbon dioxide waste away. And our circulatory systems in animals can be either open or closed. And open circulatory is one like what a grasshopper has, and they're are not a bunch of blood vessels or networks of blood that contain the blood. So the heart, they have a heart potentially, and it pumps, but that liquid that it pumps just kind of goes out and like gushes out into its body and then comes back into the heart and gushes out into the body and gets sucked back into the heart. But there's not exactly a blood vessel, an artery, or a vein that connects from here to here. It's just like gushed out into the body where the organs are. So in an open circulatory system, you do not have very many arteries and veins, and they don't connect and pass material throughout the body. The heart can just pump the material out, it gushes around within the organism, and then gets sucked back into the heart. So that's open circulatory system. Closed circulatory system, earthworms have it, humans have it, a lot of different animals have it, but a closed circulatory system means you have a heart and it pumps blood out to your arteries, and then there's capillaries or small arteries and veins, and then there's veins that bring the blood back to the heart. So in a closed circulatory system, it's completely in a loop. There are a network of blood vessels, so the heart pumps blood out into the arteries, and then those arteries turn into capillaries, and they turn into veins, and then they go back to the heart. But you can see the blood is always contained within a network of blood vessels in a closed circulatory system, which is different from open. Next, let's talk about movement. You need to know two words. Motile means capable of motion, it can move, and sessile means fixed in one place or immobile. So a cheetah is motile, and a starfish is motile. You can see it actually move. It has these little tube feet under it. But these organisms, this barnacle, is sessile. Once it's attached somewhere, it cannot move on its own. And this right here, which is a coral, that coral is sessile. Once it starts growing in one place, it does not move. So motile can move, sessile is stuck in one place. All right, reproduction. There are two types of reproduction that we'll talk about in this class, asexual and sexual. We've talked about that already with our characteristics of living things, but just as a reminder, asexual reproducers have a single parent who reproduces by themselves. So that's an example is planaria, a type of flatworm. You can actually slice it and it will grow two heads. You can then slice it all the way down and it will have two separate organisms without having a mother and a father genetically. So in asexual reproduction, an organism can reproduce without there being two parents. In sexual reproduction, two cells from different parents actually have to come together. Those cells would have had to go through meiosis and you will produce a new organism. Those are an example there. Those are two snails that are mating. They're doing sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction, two parents, asexual, one parent just splits in half and the offspring are genetically identical. All right, body structure here. 4 words to know. An exoskeleton. Exoskeleton is an external skeleton or a tough outer covering that protects and supports the body of many of our invertebrate animals. Chordate. Chordate is going to be in the phylum Chordata, and that's an animal that at least in one stage of its life has a dorsal hollow nerve cord. And what does that mean? Dorsal means on the back, hollow means it's not filled all the way through, and it's a nerve cord. So chordates have a nerve cord running on their back. Vertebrates have a vertebral column or a backbone. So if the organism has bones that surround that nerve cord, it is a vertebrate. And if it is an invertebrate, it might have the nerve cord, but it does not have backbone around the nerve cord. So exoskeleton is an external covering or external skeleton. Chordate means it has a nerve cord. Vertebrate has a backbone, and invertebrate does not have a backbone. I'll show you some images of that. So this tarantula is a type of organism that has an exoskeleton. It has an external skeleton that can be actually shed as it grows, and this is how that looks. There it is, shedding its exoskeleton. You can see the tarantula emerging there, and that's its exoskeleton that it's getting rid of. So you can see that exoskeleton, and then the tarantula will continue to grow. And as that tarantula continues to grow, it will eventually shed again and release its exoskeleton again. All right, this is an organism that is a vertebrate. You can see its spinal cord is actually contained within bone there. These are some organisms, a tunicate, and this one in particular is a tunicate that's an adult, and this one is a tunicate when it's a juvenile or a young one. And you can see there it has a nerve cord. Now, it doesn't have bones or anything around it, and it only has that nerve cord when it's a young tunicate. So that's considered a chordate, but it is not a vertebrate. This one here, though, instead is a vertebrate. Octopus here, you can see, is actually considered to be an invertebrate. So it does have a nerve cord, but it does not have bone around its nerve cord, so it is an invertebrate. So here you have an animal with an exoskeleton. You have a chordate that is a vertebrate. It has bone, and that's that stingray. Here you have a chordate that is not a vertebrate. It only has the cord in the early stage of life. And then here you have an invertebrate. It does have a spinal cord, but it does not have bone around the spinal cord, so it is an invertebrate. Thanks for listening.